This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, thank you, lady, for letting us know. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you again. A lot has happened since our last session at the end of December, and so many events are going on this week. I read a quote that I thought was good. I'd read it before because I love history. And this historian said there are some decades in history that very little happen, but there are some weeks that decades happen. And this is one of those weeks that kind of decades of events all around the world are just all swirling around us and taking place. It's funny, some of the newscasters that try to follow it were complaining yesterday that they are exhausted from trying to keep up with so many events happening in 1 week. I thought, well, that's better than the alternative, where you have nothing to report, so you got to try to make up stuff. Anyway, thank you for joining in. I'm calling this session 57, but it's really the second session of this type, and it's part two of our study of Daniel 10 through 12. And before we jump into, I'm going to be sharing maybe a document or two on screen. Uh, we ended last session with a really good uh, points being made of a variety of ways, uh, talking about how do you approach prophecy in general. And I think that the challenge that a lot of us face when we're studying prophecy, since the Bible, so much of it deals with prophecy, is what do you take literally and what do you take symbolically or spiritualize it into something not quite as literal that is really trying to picture something beyond what you're reading and interpreting as literal. And, a lot of times it's a mix. Uh, I would encourage you in the study of prophecy to always keep in mind the underlying principle of already not yet. I think that is a really important principle in prophecy. One of the best examples of that is Peter quoting Joel on the day of Pentecost. And he says, "This is that." But then you read what he quoted from Joel and you say, "Yeah, this is that, but it's not all that, is it?" That so much of what he quoted from Joel obviously has a second coming fulfillment, but a partial fulfillment on the day of Pentecost. So the idea of already but not yet, partial yet complete later, is a lot of what prophecy does. And the discussion last time along this line centered on 2 Thessalonians 2:4, even though we're in Daniel. But that's the verse that it's one of those verses that if you want to know in a real quick way, kind of how a Bible teacher approaches prophecy, especially the end times, is ask them their opinion on 2 Thessalonians 2:4. And there's wait for their response. And of course, that's talking about the Antichrist. And that's the verse that describes, it's Paul's version of the abomination of desolation. And he's clearly speaking about the man of sin in verse 3, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshiped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. I've tried to make the case the last number of years that this is describing what Lucifer did in heaven now taking place on earth through his man on earth. So those great passages in Isaiah and Ezekiel that describe the fall of Lucifer because of his pride, his rebellion, his rejection of God's will in his life, um, is going to take place in the Antichrist in pretty much exactly the same way. So the abomination of desolation to me is simply Satan through his man on earth attempting the same thing to oppose and exalt himself. Isn't that exactly what Lucifer did? And he's doing it again. He just now is doing it through a human. Opposes and exalts. That is the abomination of desolation. It is a rebellion against God, a revolt against Christ. And so that's why I also make 2 Thessalonians 2:4 to be the definition of the apostasy of verse 3. So I know not many of you do that, but I think in context, that's exactly what's happening is in verse 3, the apostasy, we call it the falling away, but I simply call it the revolt, the rebellion. And it's described in verse 4. What is the apostasy? He opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God. Many say, well, a falling away can't happen unless you're first in the truth. To a degree, I accept that. I simply say Lucifer was in the truth before he rebelled against it. And he's doing the same thing now through the antichrist. It's an extension of what he did in heaven. So I'd have no problem making the abomination of desolation the expression of what the apostasy is. Now, when he does that, certainly many people who call themselves followers of Christ will have be forced to make a choice, and many of them will fall away. So there is that aspect to it, but I think the larger aspect is what the Antichrist is doing in the abomination of desolation. But the part I'm trying to get to regarding literal or symbolic or spiritualizing it says he sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And many people, some of you, no doubt, say that since Paul defines the temple in his writings as the church, and he does, then this must mean something about the church, not a literal temple in Jerusalem. But I do make it a literal temple in Jerusalem because my argument is Paul is directly referencing Jesus in Matthew 24, and both of them are directly referencing Daniel. And so if you go all the way back to Daniel, since Jesus tells us to in Matthew 24, then clearly the abomination of desolation is in a literal temple that he's thinking of, because the whole discussion from the vision or the revelation at the end of chapter 9 of the decree to return and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem is Daniel has in mind a literal temple being rebuilt and a literal city of Jerusalem and the Jewish religion being restored in that. And so my main point is that Paul is directly thinking of that, not his attempt to get the churches to understand they are now the spiritual temple of God. He's referring to an event in the future by a literal man in a literal temple. And so that's how I have wrestled with this whole challenge of literal or symbolic, and in that case, I make it literal. Um, so I want to let me see. I'm going to bring up a little chart in just a minute, but I do want us to maybe reinforce that point a little bit. Go into Daniel together if you have your Bibles. And in chapter 8 is the first use of this idea of sacrifices being uh, eliminated or not allowed anymore, and the abomination of desolation, chapter 8, and verse 11. He even exalted himself. Now, this is the little horn of verse 9. So then the challenge becomes in Daniel, when is he referring to Antiochus of the Seleucid kingdom and the time of the Maccabees and what he did in the temple at that time? But I would point out, if you make this only to refer to Antiochus, it still is a literal event in a literal place that Paul is still drawing from in 2 Thessalonians 2. But I take this passage in chapter 8 to be more than Antiochus, but referring to the final Antichrist, because he calls him a little horn. And there are other passages in chapter 11 that people refer to Antiochus that I make the Antichrist because Antiochus was part of a powerful empire. I don't know that he could be described as a little horn rising up among a small people in chapter 11, but the Antichrist will. The Seleucid Empire was a large empire. Now, it was controlled by his time by the Roman Empire, but it was still powerful in its own way, and it still had a big sway in that part of the world. So I make this little horn in chapter 8, verse 9, to be the same little horn in chapter 7 and verse 8. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one. Uh, and I think that's ultimately referring to the Antichrist. So in verse 10, it says in chapter 8, it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host, some of the stars to the ground, and trampled them. Now, Antiochus did do a lot of harm to the Jews, to the temple, to the city. But most of his interest was elsewhere. And these verses seem to be describing something beyond Antiochus, but to the final great rebel. Verse 11, he even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. Now, Antiochus, he called himself Epiphanes, the bright one, the brilliant one. Um, and so a lot of these qualities were in him, but again, I think it's something beyond that. And by him, the daily sacrifices were taken away. Well, Antiochus literally did that. That's really the point I'm trying to make, is that this daily sacrifices being taken away is a literal event, whether by Antiochus or by the Antichrist. And the place of his sanctuary was cast down. That's kind of referring to the abomination of desolation, as it goes on to say. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. Well, Antiochus did, but the Antichrist, through the false prophet and the mark of the beast, and the image that he sets up, is truly casting truth down to the ground. He opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God. That is casting truth to the ground. That is the apostasy. That is the rebellion. He did all this and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who is speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary was to be trampled underfoot? Then it goes on to talk about the cleansing of the temple, which is kind of a separate subject. My point is, this first use in Daniel I make to be Antiochus, but more than Antiochus, goes beyond him, the already not yet, the partial and then complete in the Antichrist. Okay, so that's where Daniel later draws from in that Revelation vision, you might call it, of chapter 9 in verse 27. We all know it quite well. He shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Now I'll stop there, and I'd make this point. And the overall point I'm trying to make it right now is to approach these kind of prophecies. Let your default be literal, and then symbolic and spiritual if it needs to be, because a lot of it is. But let your default be literal instead of first trying to seek the symbolic meaning and make that the whole truth. First, seek the literal meaning and then let the symbolic come into it afterward. I think that's a really important principle. So the point I want to make on this, the idea of literal or symbolic, is that I think we all would make the 70 weeks of time in this prophecy, the 70 times 7, 490 years. I think we all would make it literal. It's 70 periods of 7 years. Now, many, or some of you, but many do in verse 27. Uh, in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Many make this Christ on the cross and his death ending the sacrificial system in the temple. The problem I have with that, and I've tried to adopt that view through the years because it just seems on the surface it just seems to make sense. That's what he did on the cross. So there you might make a certain application to that. But what's the primary meaning? I would say this: if the first 69 weeks are literal periods of 7 years, 483 years, then this final 70th week is also a literal period of 7 years. When did Jesus confirm a covenant for a period of 7 years? Literally, he didn't. He never set a time period for making or confirming a covenant for a period of 7 years. If you make this Christ on the cross, you're saying 3.5 years into the 70th week, he ended the sacrifices, the middle of the week. Okay, what happens literally 3.5 years after Christ died? Now, those who hold that position make it the stoning of Stephen, maybe other events early in Acts. As great as those events are, they don't rise to the level of fulfilling the 70th week in my mind. But the coming of Christ and the destruction of antichrist does fulfill the high level of requirement to conclude the 70 weeks. So again, the point is, if you make this Christ on the cross ending the sacrificial system, uh, then when did he make a 7-year covenant? And what event 3.5 years after the cross? Now, then some say that that only half of the 70th week was fulfilled his first coming, and then the second half is out in the future, connected with this second coming. Um, but the wording in this verse doesn't seem to lend itself toward a separation within the 70th week into two periods separated by a long period of time. So I make this confirming a covenant, making strong a covenant, confirming a covenant, I think, that is already has already been made by God with Israel, with Abraham, of their right to exist, their right to exist in their promised land, and their right to the Temple Mount in some way. I think that is the terms of the covenant that will be agreed to between the Antichrist and Israel. In my mind, is because Israel has beat the stuffing out of that 10-nation confederation that tried to destroy them. And so they are willing to come to terms with Israel to stop the bloodshed and to buy time to plan a future attack, which they will at the end of the 70th week. And Israel will want it because, like just right, we see what's going on right now. I mean, they're getting their hostages back, but they're also releasing hundreds and hundreds of Islamic terrorists kind of guys in their prisons. So that's a pretty uneven swap. But the pressure to get the hostages back has caused Israel to agree to the terms of that treaty, or whatever they might call it, a cessation of hostilities. And there's a revolt within Israel of those who think that this whole effort in Gaza by Israel is for nothing because Hamas still is in place and they still will try to operate after all of this is over. So I think we're going through something to where we can understand 927 a little better, I think. He's going to confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. And that 1 week is a period of 7 years. So, if you apply this to Christ on the cross, you have to at least work out what are the literal 7 years and what happens 3.5 years after he ends the sacrifices on the cross, because it happens in the middle of the week. And then the rest of 27 speaks about the abomination of desolation. And then in 1131, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress, another word for the temple. And would the sanctuary fortress in Daniel's mind be spiritualized or literal? And again, Paul is referring back to these passages. Then they shall take away, and in some versions of the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, take away is translated in the Greek by them as a form of apostasia. Actually, not the exact word, but a form of it. And so I take this idea of taking away that the antichrist does, which is connected with the rest of that verse, the abomination of desolation. These two events are always connected together. And the taking away of the daily sacrifices is always mentioned first. So I think there's a time order. First, the daily sacrifices are taken away. That's the apostasy. And then he declares himself, opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, declaring himself that he is God. That's the last part of that, verse 31, the abomination of desolation. So I think 2 Thessalonians 2:4 is just a rewording of Daniel 11:31 in Paul's own language. And then in 12:11, and from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, again in Septuagint, that's a form of apostasia, and the abomination of desolation is set up. So again, both mentioned together as a single unfolding event happening at the same time. But there's something that happens first and there's something that happens second. There shall be 1,290 days. And in both 1131 and 1211, the term daily sacrifices is the Hebrew word tamid, which all through the Old Testament is simply the normal word for their daily sacrifices and the daily fire that is burnt in the temple. So those are some things that guide me toward a more literal interpretation of what Paul is saying in 2 Thessalonians 2, that the temple is the same temple that Jesus was looking at on Mount Olives, Matthew 24, and the same temple in prophecy that Daniel was being told of in connection to the decree for them to go back and rebuild the temple in chapter 9. That's the underlying element in all of this, is what was the temple that they had in mind that Paul was referencing. Now, if one of my trusty helpers, I didn't connect with Gary J, but I think Eric and Philip, you have that document I sent on the abomination of desolation. If you could throw that up on the screen, please. And I'll send this to all of you later. Are you able to share it?
Do you want the picture of Netanyahu? Do you want the
No,
session
no, the other one.
15 or 16 handout?
No. The one I sent to you a few days ago that's on the abomination of desolation, that document that you said looked good.
Oh, that one. Yes.
Yeah.
Philip, do you have that handy? I neglected to grab that real quick. My apologies. Let me go search for it.
Philip or Gary?
Yes. Yes.
Rick,
Hold
while
on.
they're looking for that, does GoTo have the ability to provide a transcript of this meeting? Do you know?
Probably. Gary J might know the answer to that, or actually, John Miller probably knows the answer to that. The answer is probably yes. Are you able to throw that up on screen, Philip?
Yes, sir, I have it. Let me grab the share button here.
Okay. So I put together all the key verses that speak about the abomination of desolation. I already read several of them, but it really helps just to see a list put together. And the reason I put this together is I think it's coming up there. There you go. Thank you.
Is that it, brother?
Yeah, I see it. Everybody see it okay? So
Yes.
all these verses, and I want you to look at the red letter underline words, and because if you make the ending of the sacrifices to be Christ on the cross, then you tend to also make the abomination of desolation in the temple to not be a literal, actual, maybe event, like I think it is him standing in the temple declaring himself that he is God. And so all these verses, it's interesting the different action words describing the abomination of desolation. So in 11:31, he will place there. It's a literal idea. He places there. In 12:11, it's set up. The abomination is. So one point I'm making it to me, it's hard to spiritualize these kind of words. Jesus said, "When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place," and same thing in Mark 13:14. But he adds the idea standing where it ought not. Um, so I don't know how these kind of ideas would manifest themselves in a worldwide group of local visible churches. How would it manifest itself? In 2:4 of 2 Thessalonians, he sits as God in the temple of God. And then 13:15, the false prophet, that the image of the beast should speak. So all of these are kind of just simple literal ideas that put together, I think, eliminates the idea of trying to spiritualize it to accomplish all these different things. And the variety of words used, I think, kind of undergirds a more literal idea. So I say these all describe a literal event in a literal place called the temple and the holy place, all of which is based in Daniel, was Jesus, and then Paul referring back to that key event in Daniel. Thus, the temple of the Jews, not the temple as the church. A literal event in a literal place by a literal man to a literal your people. That's what those three chapters in Daniel are referencing, your people of Daniel. The daily sacrifices that start with a covenant treaty and then are stopped by antichrist is the Hebrew word tamid, which is the normal word for the daily sacrifices, and continual fire. So tamid is translated both as daily and continual. They are stopped at the same time as the abomination of desolation happens, thus both are directly connected to a Jewish temple in Jerusalem in Antichrist's attempt to control, as imitator, the city of the great king. Now, this kind of swerves into another large idea that a lot of us are challenged with. I think most of us would call ourselves premillennial, at least in a general sense. I am. I don't hold a lot of the tenets of extreme dispensationalism that most of them are premillennial, but they have a pre-tribulation rapture, a wall of separation between Israel and the church. There are no connections. They basically have two olive trees instead of one olive tree from Romans 11. And they have other things that I just can't really accept, but I do accept that the premillennial idea that evil men and impostors will wax worse and worse leading up to the return of Christ, and that it's going to take his return to put a stop to all of that. So that would not put me as a post-mill that says the gospel is going to be the conquering agent that's going to dominate the world. And of course, when you point out, post-mill was really popular before World War I because many historians say things were at their best, at least in Western civilization, right around 1900. In the age of exploration, new inventions, the automobile, airplanes, and all that. But then World War I and then World War II happened, and then many wars since, and more people were killed in the 20th century than any other century. So it dented the post-mill idea. So now what I hear from that position is that, well, the fulfillment of the gospel conquering the world, at least to a degree enough to usher in the millennial on its own, may take thousands of more years. So there's going to be setbacks, but eventually it's going to happen. So I don't buy that. But the all-mill position is very popular, and it has as its default, always look at the scriptures with symbolism or spiritualizing in mind. That's your first approach. So it's a less literal approach. But I would encourage you, I think the downfall of pre-mill approach to the Bible is that in its effort to be literal, it becomes too literal and doesn't allow enough room for symbolism, themes, similar themes to be developed through the Bible that are all connected to each other, spiritualizing much of prophecy, realizing that apocalyptic language allows itself for much symbolism. So I accept a lot of that, and I would encourage you to not reject that, because you'll miss out a lot of what the scriptures are trying to say. It becomes richer and deeper and more beautiful if you allow the symbolism to come through. So I'm in no way trying to discourage that. I'm just saying in these passages, I think there is a literal aspect that should be looked at. Be careful if you follow some amillennial YouTube videos or websites and so forth. It might encourage you to look at the scriptures more symbolic, and I think that part is good. But most all-mill people are also preterist, meaning they think most all prophecies were fulfilled in 70 AD, and there's very little left for the future. They are mostly replacement theology, that the church completely replaced Israel and there is no future for ethnic Israel. And I reject that outright. And so, any one of these ways of approaching scripture have their strong points and weak points. Getting back to Daniel 10 through 12, finally, I guess I'm looking at chapter 11 especially. You can go ahead and take that down if you don't mind, Phil. Thank you.
Brother Rick, I'd like a copy of that if you wouldn't mind. How much
Yeah,
are you charging?
I'll be sending out a copy to all of you. I think it's just a simple way of showing that there is a literal aspect to this abomination of desolation, which then I think lends itself more to the temple being a literal temple rather than making a literal abomination and a spiritual application to the temple. I think that's trying to mix the two where they don't, or where they don't need to be. But one of the main ways I look at chapter 11, and I've tried to make the argument that starting in verse 21 of Daniel 11, it does transition over, even though it includes Antiochus, so history to us, all of its prophecy to Daniel, that it's again this already not yet, this partial, and then total fulfillment later. That verse 21 brings in the Antichrist. You don't have to wait to verse 31 or 36 or wherever you make it. And a simple way, I said last time, to show this is that if you go to the last verse, 45, and look at the personal pronouns of he, his, and him, and we all agree that's the Antichrist, and trace it backwards, it does go all the way back to verse 21, referring to the same person. So in some way, verse 21 includes the Antichrist. And I take it to mean primarily the Antichrist, where some might make it primarily Antiochus or all of it Antiochus. That simple exercise may open a lot of it up to you. And so that prince to come back in 926, the people of the prince to come, that prince to come that is introduced by that name in chapter 9:26. I think chapter 11 is simply the enlargement of that prince to come. So he introduces him by that term, chapter 9 of that Revelation, and then he goes into great detail about him in chapter 11. Now, I'm going to stop here because I've put out quite a bit, and I'm going to give first opportunity. I haven't been looking for raised hands yet, sorry. Eric has to leave in 20 minutes. And Eric sent me a document this morning that has a lot of his thoughts, and some of it ties into what I just said. So, Eric, you have first opportunity to respond to any of this.
Well, thank you for that. And I don't want to take much time here. In fact, maybe at another session, I don't want to take away from all that's being said here. But what I do see is I try to see what's happening in the real world and find a balance, not to get too sold or tunnel visioned on any specifics, but to be open minded to say, this is one way it could play out. This is another way it could play out. And what I see is, as I'm following sources of what's happening on the ground, is that the upcoming attack that's going to be taking place in 2025 is going to really put October 7th and 9/11 in the shadows by comparison. It's going to be US and Europe at the same time. And the forces behind it are definitely trying to destabilize the West. And of course, they are very much focused on these same antichrist goals against Israel and the supporters of Israel. And I don't want to thank you for the opportunity. I don't want to take a lot of time with this morning away from everything else here and the focus and momentum here. I do have a side note, other thoughts on Christ and the 70 weeks. While I agree 100% personally with everything about the Antichrist there, I don't think that takes away necessarily from Christ, but that can be a separate conversation for another time. I don't want to take away from that. I don't see.
Just quickly, if you make him ending the sacrifices from God's viewpoint on the cross, what do you do with the second half of that 70th week?
I actually don't do that. I take the verse about the covenant 4 week. That Hebrew preposition doesn't necessarily mean for; it means during the 70th week. I see the midweek, the middle of the 70th week. If you do the timing of it directly from the 458 declaration for return, 490 years from that is the year 33 when I believe Christ was on the cross. 3.5 years before that is the beginning of his ministry, when John the Baptist, the priest, declared him and said, what looked just like the scriptures say, when you see the Antichrist, here the Antichrist is flipping the script on Christ. John the Baptist declared, behold the Lamb who takes away the sins of the world. From that point in the year 29, the middle of the 70th week, that's when that took place. Now, everything that I see about Christ in that doesn't take away anything from the Antichrist. I don't think things have to be all one or all the other. I think everything that you point out on the Antichrist is dead on. And I just see the Antichrist motive is to be looking at Christ's playbook, if you will, and inverting that and flipping that. So he's on a mission to counter and undo everything Christ did. But that's just my 2 cents on that. But the real concern is the awareness spiritually of what's happening physically today. And I could take more time on another occasion for that, but really just be aware and alert that there is a definite attempt to shatter the confidence in current systems today, and especially the support of Israel, because there's going to be a big shaking. I hope it doesn't happen, but all signs are pointing to it. And there's a case to where, just like Satan, he does his best work when no one believes in him. Folks like Al Qaeda, who are thought to be nothing, are still on the rise, and pointing back to this whole Temple Mount motivation. And I would throw this out there too. When it comes to the Temple Mount, understand when I say this, it doesn't matter what the Jews think of the Temple Mount. It doesn't matter what the Christians think of the Temple Mount. It matters what the enemy thinks of the Temple Mount. Osama bin Laden put out his letter after 9/11 saying it was because of the Temple Mount and Israel's efforts towards that and your support of that 9/11 happened. That letter got revived and revisited after October 7th. The October 7th planners, they wanted to do it earlier, but got pushed back by all the drone strikes hitting them with with Trump's administration. Under Biden, with the fall of Afghanistan, they were able to regroup. It ended up happening in 2023. Maybe a spiritual hand involved in making that timing and the spiritual application of the Jubilee. But they also said, with that new timing, hey, it was because of the red heifers brought in September of 2022. It was because of the attempted Passover celebration in 2023, all pointing to the Temple Mount. So I would say it doesn't matter what the Jews or the Christians think about the Temple Mount as far as how these things happen or what's going to happen. It really matters what the Antichrist thinks of the Temple Mount, what the enemy thinks of the Temple Mount. And that's going to be the deciding factor in how these things play out. I've got other thoughts along these lines, but I don't want to take a lot of time here this morning.
Before you have to take off, would you throw up that picture of Netanyahu that you showed me this morning? The reason I wanted this up is because so much of chapter 11 deals with these two, king of the north and king of the south, and the people that follow them. And so that's so much involved in prophecy. And yet Netanyahu, whether he's a believer or not, he showed these at his UN speech last September or October that that I think graphically shows kind of the geography, at least, of these two warring parties that are going to lead up to the Battle of Armageddon. You got it to share?
They'll see in that?
Yeah. So he shows these two maps, which in my mind is more, he has it the curse and the blessing. And he's basically saying most of the Islamic nations that want to destroy Israel are north of Israel, and most of those who want to work with Israel are south of Israel. But I didn't think of it as curse and blessing. I thought there's the king of the north and the king of the south, and how that they're in chapter 11 are described as clashing with each other. And I think we're seeing the build up to that right now, where it does seem to be heading toward an alignment of those Islamic nations that are more militant and those that are more accommodating, because they see the mainly financial value of working with Israel. And the king of the south is usually described in these passages in Daniel 11 and elsewhere as um, trying to oppose or stop the plans of the king of the north, which is where the antichrist is going to come out of, is that northern section of Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. It's interesting, he doesn't have Turkey on the curse. They should be, but they are part of NATO, so he probably thought that would offend a bunch of the Western nations, so he didn't include Turkey, but it really should be on there. And that where those three countries kind of come together seems to be the area. He's called the Assyrian in Micah chapter 5, the Antichrist is. That when Christ comes back, he's going to deliver us from the Assyrian. And so right in that area is where the Antichrist, and it's always describes him as heading south toward Jerusalem, fighting with the king of the south. And of course, it's enlarging on Antiochus and Ptolemy of ancient times, but it has an end time application also. And I just thought it was so interesting that what we see in the Bible as king of the north, king of the south, Netanyahu is showing in context of Daniel 28, the curses and the blessings, and which nations are a blessing to Israel and which nations are a curse to Israel. So he's like holding up a beautiful map of prophecy that he doesn't even recognize, I don't think, what he's doing. I just thought that was real interesting. So, Eric, you may want to just share that with everyone, send it out
Yeah,
or something.
you
That
betcha.
would be great. Anyone
Will
else
do.
have anything you'd like to say before we move on?
I too, Brother Rick, agree that it's literal, uh, uh, entwined with the spiritual, of course. Uh, but I think the whole purpose of this is to reset, to set the King Jesus as Melchizedek, priest, with his priesthood. And so I think, yeah, that's what God is driving at. So there's a lot more literal in this in dealing with Israel along those lines. So these things are being acted out uh, real time, right before our very eyes. But there's a target in mind. There's an end game in mind with Jesus and his people.
Anyone else? Okay, you can take that down, Eric. Thank you. I really want to get into chapter 12 before I don't want time to get away from us before we get into chapter 12, but I do want to bring out a few more things from chapter 11. Uh, when it says in verse 29, at the appointed time you shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. And this is another one. I know some people try to find application to Antiochus in verse 30. I think a lot of that's a stretch, but be that as it may, I think it easily can be fulfilled in our day. For ships from Kittim or Kittim, Cyprus area, which of course is simply the Mediterranean, everything that comes to Israel from that direction, it passes by Cyprus. So it's really ships from the Mediterranean, you might say, Western powers, I would call it, shall come against him. So there's coming a point where in some way the Western powers are going to say something like, been trying to work with you. You've done a lot of good, but you're going too far. Uh, it's apparent that your real plans are to destroy Israel rather than have a peace treaty with them. And so they're going to stop him from an early effort. And of course, part of this is the providence of God because the abomination doesn't happen till the middle of the week. And that's in verse 31. So evidently, he makes an effort before the middle of the week to show his hand against the Holy Covenant. He's in rage against the Holy Covenant, that verse says. He's hated it all along. He's looking for an opportunity to break it. And so he makes an effort, and the Western powers say, no, no, you're not. Whatever they do, whether it's the Seventh Fleet of the U.S. or something from the European nations, a show of force to some degree, because we're in a time where you don't have to land an army or Marines uh, on the land itself. Just offshore, you can do tremendous damage to an army that's coming down from the north into Israel and stop them, maybe using the Air Force along with that. And so he's going to be stopped, but then he regroups, and verse 31 is the middle of the week. And in the middle of the week, he takes away the daily sacrifices, places there the abomination of desolation. I would tie this in quickly um, to 12:11, where it speaks about the same things. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, the abomination is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. So that's always a big debate. Why is it 1260 all the way through, including in Revelation? 1260, 42 months, time times half a time, 3.5 years. Very exact. But this one verse out of all of them has that extra 30 days. Now, normally, and I'm not rejecting it, but normally we place that meaning 30 days beyond the 1260 and then try to figure out what happens beyond the 1260. And that's good. But I've also wondered if these two events are so large in themselves that I think it might be a mistake to conclude they happen on the same day, 24-hour period. And so that handout or the two handouts I ask all of you to print out if you can, if you're referring to that. One is session 15, the study handout. If you could put that up real quick, or you're probably getting ready to leave, but if you could put that up real quick. And I taught this a few years ago on our Tuesday night end time studies, what happens in the middle of the week. That's really a good study in itself. It's a collision of major events. The reason I wanted to put it up briefly is I name 8 major events that happen right in the middle of the week. And I have 2 possible time orders of the first 4 events. It's kind of hard to see, isn't it? Oh, that's not too bad. And I put the numbers in the middle of the week, then I go down and I list what each number means. So I hope it's clear to understand. And normally we put 1 and 2 in our minds happening in the middle of the week. We have them happening on the same 24-hour period. But I offer an alternative underneath that. I put, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, I put 1, 3, 4, 2, meaning I think it's really possible that he breaks the covenant and that causes such a pushback by Israel that number 3 happens from Revelation 12. Satan is cast down and he knows he has a short time. That's when he incarnates the antichrist, but he incarnates him, I think, after the 4th event, the death and resurrection. His deadly wound was healed, and that's kind of a mystery. But if that is a literal death and coming back to life, or at least it appears to be, with the use of AI, you can make anything appear real now, then my point is that the ending of the sacrifices comes first 30 days before the abomination of desolation. And then 3 and 4 happens. He has a death and resurrection event, which he might, an assassination attempt by Israel would be a likely scenario because of what he did by ending the daily sacrifice, breaking his promise, essentially. He had a 7-year promise and he breaks it in the middle. And they push back, and somehow it's this death and resurrection event, and Satan incarnates him. And at that point, an antichrist becomes the antichrist. That's when he becomes full of his power, is when Satan incarnates him, however that happens to some degree. And then he goes into the temple and declares himself God. My point is this, that the huge event of breaking the covenant might happen 30 days before the abomination, so that the 1260 and the 1290 actually have the same endpoint. 1290 is from the start of his rebellion when he breaks that covenant. 1260 is from the abomination of desolation 30 days later, both of them ending at the same point. Something for you to consider. I'm not adamant about it. The normal interpretation is that the 1290 goes 30 days beyond, but I'm thinking they may end at the same point with a 30-day different starting point of those two events. So let you give some thought to that. You can take that down, Eric. Thank you. And then I want to deal with 1133. I think this is really a large part of this chapter. Since I believe that the church will go through the tribulation, there will be, I think the tribulation saints and the church saints are the same saints in my mind. They're not two separate groups of people. And what will their role be in all of this? And so it says in 1133, well, let's go back to 32. Those who do wickedly against the covenant I think that's Antichrist and his 10-nation confederacy. They break that covenant. They attempt to start destroying Israel. He shall corrupt with flattery. In other words, he's going to get them back on board with his plans. But the people who know their God, that's the tribulation saints. It's not yet national Israel. They're not converted until Christ returns. The people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. We normally focus on the martyr aspect, the persecution aspect, the beheading aspect of the saints in the last 3.5 years. But these verses show the other side of the coin. They show the courage, the bravery, the faith, the love, the devotion, the willingness to stand for what they know is going to happen, and they're preaching it loudly, and they're being killed because of it. They're going to carry out great exploits. There's going to be that vision in Revelation 6 and 7. Who are these that come out of the great? These are those who come out of the great tribulation. Who is this? Uh, this group of people without number. They come out of the great tribulation. So some of the great exploits that the church is going to do during that time is to preach the gospel so clearly and so strongly, and be able to point out soon coming events that will happen, and people will see it, that it will cause many people to turn to Christ. I am convinced that in the midst of great martyrdom, in the midst of great tribulation, in the midst of great wrath of God, all that's happening, a lot of it at the same time, many will be turning to Christ because of our witness. Those are the people who understand. So here I want to talk about the masculine. It's a term maybe some of you are unaware of. It's a plural word. Anytime in Hebrew you have I am on the end of a word, it's plural. It's a group of people. Maskil is a word strong. If you want to search it out, it's Strong's number 7919, 7919. And it means to be attentive. It's a lot like the word Shema, to listen to God and pay attention and obey and follow Him. The masculine, and that Hebrew word is translated here in 33, who understand, the people who understand. It's also translated in verse 35, those of understanding. It's also translated in 12:10, the wise. The wise shall understand. I think we really miss out on the aspect of that the vision of the church, in times of crisis, your vision becomes clearer. You become single-minded. You become focused on the important things and forgetting the things that are unimportant. You have very focused sight and thinking. And the masculine at that time will be like Daniel in his prayer, in his fasting. We're going to know exactly what is going on and when. We're going to tell others. We're going to be martyred, but we're not going to have any fear. We're going to have courage, like our Anabaptist forefathers, many of them. That's why 12:11 of Revelation says they love not their lives to the death. I really think the thing that we leave off the most regarding the end times, and especially regarding the saints during that time, is the grace of God will be sufficient to produce a courage and a faith in us that we've never known. And we will be an end time witness, leading to the conversion of Israel, because they see our faith, our love, our devotion to the same God they claim. And they're going to realize the part they've left off is the rejection of their Messiah. And we're the ones preaching about it. And if we can show them clearly what's going to happen next and next and next and next from the scriptures, then they will be more likely to believe us when we go to places that speak about Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah, and you crucified him, and he died for your sins. If we can show prophecy, and this is why I emphasize prophecy so much, I encourage you all to dive into it deeper, because there's a term called apocalyptic evangelism that uses prophecy as evangelism, and I think the church during the tribulation will use prophecy as evangelism, and many will turn to Christ, while many will reject him. There's going to be a separation of ways. There's a line clearly drawn that people are going to have to decide which side of that line they're going to be on. And the Bible, Revelation especially, seems to describe that many will choose Christ and many will reject him. I guess what I'm saying is there'll be no neutrality. There will be a clear division. And so it says here in 11:33, those of the people who understand shall instruct many. Well, I think with the gospel and with prophecy. Yet for many days they shall fall by sword. See, there's a falling away that's going to happen to the saints, but it's not a falling away from the truth, though many will. It's a falling away in death, in martyrdom. There will be that kind of falling away also of actual physical life. They shall fall away by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now, when they fall, not by apostasy, but by death, they shall be aided with a little help, maybe some, but many shall join them by intrigue. Some are going to do it for evil purposes. Didn't Paul say in Acts 20, 28, 29, 30? Not only will wolves come in from outside the flock, not sparing the flock, but some will rise up among you, inside and outside. And this is kind of a fulfillment of that. Verse 35, some of those of understanding shall fall, and what will be the purpose for the rest that are left, who don't quite have that faith, have that courage, have that bravery, have that clear vision, but they're trying to hold on. They're trying to stay true to Christ. It will refine them and purify them and make them white. I have been accused through the years by pre-tribulation people that a post-tribulation rapture resurrection then holds to a form of purgatory, that the purpose of the tribulation is a purgatory for the saints, to purge them. I don't agree with that the way I am accused or the way they think, but this verse does describe a purging of God's people. A purging of the world, a purging of sin, a purging of self, and complete devotion to Christ. God will use the tribulation not just for the purpose of bringing Israel to salvation, but for the purpose of purifying his church. That is an aspect that I think we need to emphasize more, because I think it will give people in the pews a greater sense of purpose, of calling, of something beyond. I don't think I can make it, that kind of persecution and suffering. I don't think I can. Don't underestimate the grace of God to turn you into 11:35. Refine, purify, and make them white, which is exactly what Paul talks about in Ephesians 5 and John talks about in Revelation 19. Their white robes that they wear is spoken of right here. If he makes us white before the rapture and resurrection, we shall be dressed in white after the resurrection and rapture, until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. Verse 36, coming full circle back to the beginning of my discussion. Verse 36 is the particular verse Paul is referencing in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. He just rewords verse 36. The king shall do according to his own will, because he's empowered by Satan. That's what Lucifer did, his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god. That's exactly what Paul says in 2:4 of 2 Thessalonians. He shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, which is exactly what Paul says. Shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done. End of verse 37, he shall exalt himself above them all. Paul is simply rewording these two verses in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. Anything before I jump into chapter 12? I don't want time to get away from us.
Good stuff, Brother Rick. I really appreciate your depth of study and probably the many hours that you put into, the many years you put into arriving at.
Well, I'm not asking anyone to agree with me. It's not my purpose. And sorry for getting off of teaching into preaching. But boy, this stuff really gets to me when I think about it. It's pretty emotional.
Yeah.
At the end of verse 46, I mean, we could go into the rest of this chapter. One thing I would say about the rest of this chapter, first of all, in the end of verse 41, these shall escape his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon, which by coincidence seems to be the wilderness place that God takes Israel into for safety from the Antichrist. And that's modern day Jordan, which is one of the most neutral of all toward Israel, at least they have been. And so God will allow that that area to escape the wrath of Antichrist because God has destined that location for the safety. That's the wilderness that Israel goes into. But the rest of this chapter is describing. We make a big mistake if we think the Antichrist has firm control over the whole world. His policies will affect the whole world, especially economic. But there are people who end up saying, you've gone too far. We're going to try to stop you. And so that's why it says in verse 44, news from the east and the north shall trouble him. He shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. Just in a real quick summary, I now look at the Battle of Armageddon beginning. The Lord gathers all the nations to Jerusalem. I used to always look at that as to destroy Israel. No, by that point, 2/3 of Israel is already destroyed, and the other third is in the wilderness protected by God. There still are Jews in Jerusalem, but the vast majority of them are either dead or in the wilderness protection. I think the nations that come to Jerusalem are there to try to overthrow the tyranny of the Antichrist, because when evil tries to unite, they end up turning on each other. I think that's what's happening here. They're turning on each other. The pride of man will not allow a single dictator to rule over them for long. They'll find a way to try to overthrow him. I think they come to Jerusalem to overthrow the power of the Antichrist because they say, you've gone too far. And he's going to be fighting against them. And only then do they look upward and heaven is opened and they see the face of him who is about to come. And then they unite together to try to fight against Christ, try to prevent, if they can keep him from reaching the earth, they feel like they can win the victory still. They don't give up to the last minute. And but I think before that, they're actually fighting each other. So think about that aspect of all these passages, that he does not have a united submission from the entire world during his entire 7 years. There is a breaking up of that acceptance of him. I mean, we can compare. I don't want to say any names because they're always brought up and easy to be brought up. But there are conquerors in history that seem like everyone was going along with him for a while, but then over time, people rebelled against him because he went too far. I think that's what the end of this chapter is describing. But chapter 12, I like it so much because it gives a happy ending to the story. And when you're talking about the end times from the Old Testament and the resurrection from the Old Testament, you are forced to a post-tribulation resurrection of at least the Old Testament saints. All of the passages in the Old Testament, beginning with Job, in my flesh I shall see him on the earth. Daniel here has the great tribulation and then the resurrection. So that's why many dispensationalists of the more extreme type, even though they're premillennial like I am, have two separate resurrections. The Old Testament saints post-tribulation, because that's the only conclusion you can reach from the Old Testament, but a pre-tribulation rapture of the New Testament saints. I make it a single resurrection rapture at the end, and this is what 12:1 and 2 describes. At that time, Michael shall stand up. One simple way of saying it, comparing it to Revelation 12, Michael stands up and Satan is cast down. And when Satan is cast down, he incarnates, at least in some way, his man, just like Christ was incarnated. You know, all these imitations, you can make a long list of how the antichrist tries to imitate Christ. And one of the ways he does it is try to become the king in Jerusalem, which is, I think, what chapter 11 is talking about. His eye is on Jerusalem. Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. There shall be a time of trouble, which Daniel is just referencing back to his mentor, Jeremiah, in 30, verse 7. That time shall be great, the time of Jacob's trouble, great trouble. So he's just rewording what his mentor Jeremiah had written. There shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time, the time your people shall be delivered, everyone who's found written in the book. So many people, and of course Jesus calls it the Great Tribulation, Matthew 24:21. When you see the abomination of desolation, verse 15 of 24, then there shall be great tribulation, verse 21. And then Revelation 7:14 calls it the tribulation, the great one, because there are two definite articles, not just one. The tribulation, the great one. And so a lot of people read a verse like this: there shall be a time of trouble such as never was. Jesus says it's going to be a time of tribulation such as never been. And so pre-tribulation is very fond of saying it's going to be the worst time ever. So God is going to allow us to escape it. He's not going to have us go through the worst time ever. One response for me would be, it will be the worst time ever for the world. It's the worst time ever in scope. It's not the worst time ever for an individual. You can't get worse than how our Anabaptist forefathers were tortured and killed. How do you get worse than that? So on an individual scale, it will return to what our forefathers faced, and they had to face it. They had to go through it. They were killed in terrible ways. But that was on a smaller scale in local places, individuals and so forth, that added up to a lot. This is going to be on a much larger scale for the world. Even to that time, at that time, your people should be delivered the same way we will be delivered after the tribulation. Everyone who is found written in the book, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Of course, this is the primary verse for those who teach the general resurrection. There's only one resurrection, the just and unjust. Everyone's judged at the same time. That's the belief of the post-millennial people. They really hit this verse really hard. That's why we have to go to the New Testament to get the further details. And that's why it's important in prophecy. Be careful about taking one place, one verse, out of context or even in context, but make the one verse teach the whole lesson. You have to compare it with many other verses to get the whole picture. Those who are wise, that's the masculine, shall shine like the brightness of the firmament. Those who turn many to righteous like the stars forever. I'm going to say one more thing about this term masculine. In the singular, maskil, it's usually spelled M-A-S-K-I-L or M-A-S-C-H-I-L. You'll see a number of the Psalms that starts off with the heading, A Maskil of David. It's a way of saying this particular psalm is more prone toward deep meditation, for wisdom, for insight, for understanding. It's just kind of a way of saying that I'm writing this psalm for you to meditate on, maybe a little deeper than some others. Maskil. You, Daniel, shut up the words, seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Many people make that the internet, knowledge shall increase. It may have some application of that. I think the idea is that the knowledge of these events will increase. You know, Jesus said to his disciples, I have many things to say to you, but you're not able to receive them yet. I think there's a lot of things about prophecy. We're not able to receive them yet. But when we're in the midst of it, our knowledge will increase. And I think that's why we will be, you know, with knowledge comes pride, of course, but knowledge mixed with love becomes power, becomes courage. And we're going to have total love for Christ. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. I think will be the primary motivation for the saints during that time. And our knowledge will increase. And so if we have the faith and the love and the devotion, and then he increases our knowledge about what's going on and what will happen and when, and we're out there preaching it, yeah, we will be killed. But let me see. Somebody just raised their hand. Who was that? Jay Wheeler. What do you have to say, Jay? Turn yourself off mute. Oh, you didn't mean to raise your hand? Okay. You hit the wrong button, I guess. Anybody else raise their hand yet? Come on. I want some discussion. Sorry about dominating this. That's why in the future, I want you to suggest topics that you've studied so that it can be more of a discussion rather than a lecture. I'm going to skip down to verse 7. I heard a man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river. He held up his right hand, his left hand to heaven, swore by him forever. So there'll be a time, times, and half a time. And when the power, I looked that up in Hebrew. It's simply the Hebrew word yad, Y-A-D. It's the normal word for hand. I think there's really something deep there. The hand representing their own power, their own strength, their own efforts, their own works, which is what we're seeing in Israel right now. They're trying their best in their own wisdom and their own strength, military, economic, political. But when the hand of the holy people in prospect, they are a holy people by election, has been completely, the old King James says scattered. Most of the newer translations say shattered. All these things shall be finished. They have to come to the end of their strength. It's a sad picture to think about. But they have to come to their knees. They have to become like Daniel in his prayer and fasting in chapter 9 before they can become converted. And I love this verse because it describes the same thing we had to do. We had to become when we first trusted in the Lord. That's why Paul may be thinking of this verse, who knows? In Romans 5 says, when we were without strength, our power was completely shattered. And if it wasn't, we couldn't be saved. But once it was, salvation was easy. But we had to reach that point. So this is a great gospel verse. It's a good text verse for a gospel message. That what Israel will be brought to for their conversion, every lost person has to be brought to for their conversion. The same principle. I did not understand. He said, "Go your way, Daniel. The words are closed up, sealed to the time of the end." So I guess there are still some things sealed up till the time of the end, and then our knowledge will increase. Many, here's back to this, many shall be purified, made white, and refined. But the wicked shall do wickedly. The lines are drawn between the two. None of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And with that understanding will come boldness to proclaim it. The time of the daily sacrifice is taken away. The abomination of desolation is set up. There shall be 1,290 days. We've dealt with that. The great mystery is the 1335. I've come to the conclusion, because of some lessons I've taught about, just like the breaking of the covenant and the abomination of desolation, I don't put both of those major events in a single 24-hour day, maybe 30 days apart. I think the return of Christ is not setting his foot on the Mount of Olives from heaven and walking immediately into Jerusalem and declaring himself to be king in a single 24-hour day. And there are other passages that prevent that idea. Isaiah 63. Why are your garments dyed red? Why are they dipped in blood coming from Bozrah? So I take that literally again. Psalm 68. I would encourage you to read Psalm 68 slowly. I think that and Isaiah 63, but Psalm 68 especially describes the true triumphal entry. And there are other passages that seem to describe, and some of us even make him go all the way as far as uh, what am I trying to think of? Sinai, Mount Sinai, and work his way up in the same path that Israel traveled to cross over into Jerusalem. And on the way, he's going to, the remainder of Israel, the elect remnant of Israel, is going to be saved. They're going to travel with him. There's going to be, Psalm 68 describes singing and praising and shouting as he marches his way up to Jerusalem. And he will set his foot on the Mount of Olives. It doesn't literally say in Acts 1 that he lands on the Mount of Olives, but he will set his feet on the Mount of Olives before he walks into Jerusalem. But I think that will be the conclusion of a 30-day or 45-day or something defeat of his enemies. He could do it in a moment. That sword goes out of his mouth and he strikes the nations. That could happen in a moment, in a 24-hour day. But I think there are reasons why he stretches it out so that it becomes a process, so that he can have his glorified saints and his newly regenerated saints of Israel, and they're still in their human bodies, coming together into Jerusalem in a triumphal entry procession, where he will, when he reaches his destination, truly be the king that he rejected in their first attempt. And go your way. I'll close with this. I think a few people have their hands up. Go your way till the end, for you shall rest. And here's Daniel's personal resurrection and inheritance. You will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days. What a way to end your life. And I think Daniel probably died very soon after this, in his early 90s. I think the Lord, at the end of his life, gave him some of the greatest prophecies in the entire Bible, starting in chapter 9, and let him close out his life seeing the whole picture of the future that ends in the return of Christ and the defeat of the enemies the greatest enemy being the antichrist himself. So let me see who has their hand up. And I don't know who was first. Do I see two hands raised? Somebody just
I
come
was
on,
last.
see who it is.
I
Oh,
was
Mike
last.
Maney and Noah Ward. Okay.
Noah was first, I'm pretty sure.
Noah, what do you have?
Well, just a quick thought on what you were saying about the procession going into Jerusalem. I really look at it as a complete fulfillment of prophecy laid down as God had promised that land to Israel. I think that as we see Christ as this greater Joshua leading the procession of his saints, the procession of his bride into the Holy Land, I think we will also see the giving of the land in its fullness that God had promised to Israel. But it's just a thought that I had.
Good thought. Thank you, Noah. Mike, what do you have?
Yeah, just could say I too, like you, had pictured it over the years as Jesus on his return, just descending down to touch the Mount of Olives. But I've since adjusted my views to this procession. There's just too many scriptures that seem to point to those who are raptured and join him in the air, that he descends then to the earth, starts in that wilderness area, like you said. And with this procession, there's going to be some battle, some fighting. And so I sent over a couple of outlines to you here this morning where the writer makes a pretty strong case for that. I don't know if you guys if you have heard of this book called God's War on Terror by Joel Richardson and Walid Shabbat. They teamed up to write this book. Anyway, he's got some good thoughts there. I think it's chapter 52 and 53. Of course, he's a universalist. They both are. So you have to kind of just spit out some of his application as to who these saints are, these Christians. But nonetheless, in our understanding, they're true saints. They're within the covenant framework as we understand it. So you kind of just, adjust your thinking along those lines. But I'm looking more toward this being a physical engagement and not so much as the sword just proceeds out of his mouth and everything is just instantaneously over with. I used to think that, but now I'm looking at it differently.
I just noticed in chat, there's a couple of, first of all, Jay Wheeler said, sorry for not being tech savvy. Just wanted to say that Paul was given a thorn in the flesh to keep him humble. Uh-oh, what did I do? Oh, there we are. I almost messed up terribly. Paul was given a thorn in the flesh to keep him humble. Humility is an important characteristic that is easily lost when opportunity for pride is available, which is exactly the sin of Lucifer and the sin of Antichrist. And I know in our pastors' discussions on the first Saturday of the month, some of us have the qualifications for pastor. That one that really ties in with this, not a novice, lest he fall into the I think the idea is the same sin, the same snare of the devil, which is pride. We can be guilty of the same sin that Lucifer and Antichrist are guilty of. Probably all of us have at different times, thankfully for the mercy of God. And then Jay says, apologies for the lateness and my father not being able to attend. My grandfather, Virgil Mooring, he was a longtime pastor in the cooperative work, broke his hip. He had surgery, is recovering. My dad is focused on it at this time. So pray for Brother Virgil Mooring. And then someone suggested that we discuss Romans 11:22 through 32 at some point in light of this discussion. According to Romans 11:25, blindness in part has come to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Well, that's a huge subject in itself. Seems at some point the Spirit of God is going to refocus from the Gentiles and once again focus Israel and even enlighten them. That's a good point. Who else has a comment? We don't have to always go 2 full hours. if you have a suggestion for future topics or passages or something, if you'd even like to lead out, I can host it, but allow you to lead out. Okay, someone else has their hand up, I see. Let me see. Steve. Which Steve?
Uh,
There's a bunch of Steves.
Southern California, Steve.
Okay. Well, there's a couple of those, but he's not on.
Just a quick point regarding prophecy. I really enjoy this, and I hope we can continue. It is a huge subject, and I think part of the problem for Christianity is so much misinformation and disinformation regarding prophecy from the universalist. And that can really cloud our thinking, which is why I really enjoy us getting together and sharing thoughts from the local church covenant position.
Amen.
Thank you, Steve. Who else? Feel free, please.
Yeah, I want to say one thing that stuck out to me. Braden from Citrus Heights is in reading all those verses regarding the taking away of the daily sacrifices and seeing in two of those places it was expressly an evil, vile person who was doing it. And then to
Yes.
take that idea and then in Daniel 9 and say the taking away the daily sacrifices there is Jesus. It's just, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying it's hard for me to swallow that when it's the pattern is there's this evil person going to take the daily sacrifices away, and then to flip that over in Daniel 9 to say that's Jesus who's doing that. It seems incongruent.
You said it better than I could. Read those passages again that speak about both events, and it's always in context of an evil person doing both. And so another reason why I can't make it Christ on the cross, even though in some way that seems to be true that he did end the sacrifices, but I guess an argument could be made. Well, I don't want to get into that. Who else has something to say? Thank you all. I would like to close with a special request. Um, and some of you know some of what I'm speaking about, others, it may be a bit of a mystery to you. But I have become convinced, I know of at least 3 churches and probably more that don't come to mind right now, that in this last year have come under severe attacks by Satan to destroy them, to split them, divide them, has attacked their pastors, families, has brought great harm. And, sometimes I almost feel half Pentecostal when I say these kind of things, but I'm seeing a trend. I wonder if Satan has decided to turn his attention against our little group of churches and pastors and is going to try to do this year great harm. I would warn us to be extremely cautious how we reply to each other in the midst of any differences or conflicts and not escalate it. And I would ask us all to pray for each other as pastors in the churches where we are shepherds of. Um, I just really believe that for some reason Satan's focus has turned to us, and we really need to hold each other up and pray for each other and support each other. Anybody have anything to add on that?
On that note, the Missoula Church has been a victim along that line. Most of you know, and if you haven't heard, then you can inquire with Brother Rick or my son Philip, or a good number of you already know, and I want you to know about it. And so, yeah, we've been dealt a heavy hand here, a real blow. But you know what? We are more than conquerors in Christ who loved us, and we are going to survive. And so I've learned some things personally from this, and I've shared those things with you guys. So I'm going to come out a better shepherd. The sheep are going to come out better sheep, and we have really good plans here in Missoula.
Our prayers are with you, Mike.
Yeah.
We love you and your family church very much.
I love you guys too. Your support has, I'm not surprised at your support, but it is overwhelming to see it. And I thank you for it.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. If you want to stay in line and maybe share information you don't want on the recording, and then that's good. Let me see. How do I stop the recording?
I have a question. I do
Yes.
have some of Philip's old homeschool books and materials.